You may not be aware, but tomorrow is the International Day to Combat Islamophobia, and the reason for that is probably because Islamophobia right now isn't that much of a problem. In fact, I'd argue that Islamophobia as a concept shouldn't exist. Now, that's not to say that discrimination against Muslims doesn't exist, but I'll come back to that in a moment. In the past 17 months or so, since Islamist Hamas terrorists attacked Israel on October 7, we've heard a lot about anti-Semitism, of course, but also quote-unquote Islamophobia, often in the same breath, as though the increase in those incidents of hatred is somehow equal.
I condemn totally any form of anti-Semitism, including the comments by my local member, the member for Newtown, whose comments about tentacles with regard to the Jewish community, I find offensive. I find it had its origins in anti-Semitism, and I condemn it unequivocally. Just as I condemn forms of that I have seen. Islamophobic comments and behaviour as well.
He can't mention one without mentioning the other. Never mind the fact that what precipitated all of this was an Islamist terror group attacking the Jewish homeland. And it was the same when he announced a special envoy for anti-Semitism. Well, we had to have a special envoy for Islamophobia too. Again, as though the increase in anti-Jewish and anti-Muslim hatred was somehow equal. And that special envoy, Aftab Malik, has since complained that we shouldn't ignore the threat to Muslims, quote, simply because we haven't seen mosques torched or cars vandalised. I would have thought Mr Malik would be grateful for that rather than complaining, but there you are. It makes it sound as though his issue is that there's not enough Islamophobia going around. Now, there are only two religions for which we ascribe a specific term to describe bigotry and discrimination against them. Judaism, anti-Semitism, and Islam, Islamophobia. And this is why I make the argument that Islamophobia as a concept shouldn't exist. Anti-Semitism is a very distinct type of bigotry because it's not just religious, it's ethno-religious. It's not just about the doctrines and values of Judaism, it's about the distinct race of Jewish people. Most anti-Semites aren't particularly worried about beliefs, they're worried about race. It is, in most cases, a form of racism. But Islam isn't a race. It's purely a religion that you can choose or choose not to belong to. It's no more a race than Christianity or Hinduism or Buddhism. But you never hear of Christophobia or Hinduphobia or Sikhophobia or Buddhist phobia, do you? The four biggest religions in the world in order are Christianity, Islam, Hinduism and Buddhism. And yet only one of them has a specific word to describe discrimination against its adherents. Why? American philosopher and neuroscientist Sam Harris has discussed this before on his podcast, Making Sense.
People criticize Christianity all the time and worry about its political and social influences, but no one confuses this for bigotry against Christians as people. There's no such thing as Christophobia. If you criticize Christianity, and I have written an entire book excoriating Christianity, no one accuses you of being a racist against people from Brazil or Mexico or Ethiopia or the Philippines. But even the New York Times will use the term Islamophobia as a synonym for racism against Arabs. This is pure delusion and propaganda. There are Christian Arabs, and I could become a Muslim in 5 minutes just by converting to the faith.
He's right. That perfectly describes why the concept of Islamophobia is nonsense. I would argue that the purpose of the concept of Islamophobia is to run cover for the religion against legitimate criticism. There's no other reason that one religion would require a specific term to describe alleged discrimination. And they do this by linking the idea of Islamophobia to racism. The two terms have somehow almost become intertwined, but they're not related at all. Islam is not a race, it's a religion, and every part of that religion should and must be up for debate. But of course, by linking it to racism, it becomes taboo to criticise Islam because we all agree that racism is bad. So if you make it that criticising Islam puts you in a special bag of Islamophobia, and that is somehow tinged by racism, then people start calling you a racist, and hopefully you pipe down. That's what they want anyway. Green Senator Marine Faruqi, she's a Muslim woman, did exactly this in a letter to the Prime Minister today. She wrote, as one of the many Muslims living in this country, I am hurt and exasperated by the glaring double standards used when it comes to calling out and dealing with Islamophobia. We are feeling really let down by the Labor government. On this International Day to Combat Islamophobia, I urge the government to drop the one-sided approach to racism, unequivocally acknowledge and tackle the breadth and depth of rising Islamophobia, and loudly reject political narratives that fuel fear, blame and hatred against Muslims. What double standards? Presumably she means you've talked too much about anti-Semitism and not enough about Islamophobia. But as I said before, anti-Semitism is intrinsically linked to racism. So-called Islamophobia is not. Doesn't matter how hard you try, it will never be racism. The idea of Islamophobia is such a joke that the Starmer government in the UK has set up a working group to try to define what it is. I mean, how hard can it be to define? Unless, of course, it's a special way to include special things in the umbrella of hatred, because, of course, we already have things like racism and discrimination and bigotry to describe forms of hate. Let me be clear. Discrimination against Muslim people does exist. Persecution of Muslim people does exist. Hatred of Muslim people does exist. But that doesn't put it in a special category, and it doesn't make it unique. There is discrimination and persecution and hatred of people of all religions across the world. For everyone else, we call that bigotry. For Muslims, for some reason, we call that Islamophobia. Now, the All-Party Parliamentary Group on British Muslims came up with a definition for Islamophobia in 2018. They decided that Islamophobia is rooted in racism and is a type of racism that targets expressions of Muslimness or perceived Muslimness. There it is again, racism. And what exactly is Muslimness? I cannot say this any more clearly. The purpose of the concept of Islamophobia is to stop criticism of the religion of Islam. And why would just one religion, the second biggest in the world, need a special term to protect it from criticism? Perhaps because there's only one religion that people feel physically unsafe to criticise or mock. You can openly mock Christianity, Monty Python, the Book of Mormon, one of the most successful musicals of all time. You can even immerse a plastic crucifix in a glass of urine, take a photo and win an award, and you'll never fear for your safety. That was 1984 that happened. But when the French magazine Charlie Hebdo published a cartoon of Muhammad, well, 12 people were killed. There's no other religion in the world that its adherents are so afraid to leave. Now, there are 10 countries in the world where apostasy, leaving the religion, is punishable by death. They are Afghanistan, Brunei, Iran, Malaysia, the Maldives, Mauritania, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates and Yemen. All of them are Muslim. There are 7 countries where homosexuality is punishable by death: Brunei, Iran, Mauritania, Nigeria, Saudi Arabia, Yemen and Uganda. All of them, except for Uganda, are Muslim. There are more places in the world, Muslim countries, where the law is unclear, and I could go on with these examples. And that, of course, is not to say that all Muslims agree with that, but that's the problem with Islamophobia. The very real persecution of individual Muslims, often perpetrated by their own Muslim brothers, it should be noted, with warring factions, is lumped into the same category as calling out the repugnant stuff I mentioned before. Yes, we should all stand up against discrimination and hatred of other human beings. But religions, ideologies, ideas should all be fair game for discussion and challenge and sometimes ridicule. Islam does not deserve special treatment.